Hello everyone and welcome to another ride overview. Most roller coasters have you sitting in a chair either above or below the track, but there are some exceptions, and two of those are the lay-down coaster and the flying coaster. Here you're not sitting or even standing, but rather lying on your back above the track or hanging below the track on your stomach, giving a unique flying experience, which is the main selling point of these two coaster types. This makes the flying and laydown coasters quite remarkable ride types in Roller Coaster Tycoon 2, and today we're going to learn all about them. The laydown coaster is sort of a combination between the corkscrew coaster and the compact inverted coaster. When you build the station and chain lift, it looks identical to the corkscrew coaster, although the trains obviously are different. The difference in the track comes when you do an inversion. On almost every other coaster type, if you do half of an inversion, like a half corkscrew, you have to follow it up with another half inversion to get you back the correct way up again. But the laydown coaster is different and you don't have to do that, you can just keep on building, but now it's upside down. Instead of lying on their backs as they started, the guests are now flying under the track, and now it looks exactly like a compact inverted coaster. The flying coaster is very similar, except it starts below the track looking like an inverted coaster, with the guests lying on their stomachs in the flying position. And just like before, you will notice a difference when you do an inversion, as you can now just continue building without finishing it, and now it looks like a twister coaster. As a kid, I was utterly enthralled by these coaster types, especially the lay-down coaster, as I thought it was so cool they could actually stay upside down. The catch is that I didn't realize that the guests were positioned horizontally, and instead I thought that the guests were actually staying upside down for extended periods of time, and I didn't see anything wrong with that. Even though on the laydown coaster the guests start on their back and in the flying coaster they start on their stomach, that doesn't really make any difference. There is no difference in stats or anything between being above and below the track, just like the seat rotation on the multi-dimension coaster, it has no effect. In the real world, these coaster types are both primarily made for flying below the track, but in this game you can do whatever you like, with the exception that you do need to include at least one inversion, as we'll see later in the stat requirements section. One oddity you might have noticed is that the switching between upright and inverted mode isn't entirely smooth. At the exact moment the ride switches from one mode to the other, the window that's following the train jumps a little bit, as the viewing anchor point of the train has suddenly changed. It's not a big deal or anything, but I do think it's an interesting little peek into how the following of the trains exactly works. These two coasters are not a complete combination of their upright and inverted counterparts though, and both are missing some track pieces that you might expect them to have. The weird thing is that the flying coaster has fewer track pieces available than the laid-down coaster, while you would expect the opposite. You see, the corkscrew coaster, compact inverted coaster and laydown coaster are all based on roller coaster models from the manufacturer Vekoma, while the twister coaster, inverted coaster and flying coaster are all based on models from B&M. Usually the B&M coaster types have higher stats and also have more track pieces available, but here it's, for that second part, the opposite. What the flying coaster does have that the laydown doesn't is sloped banked turns, which is rather helpful with keeping your lateral g-forces down, but in terms of inversions it has far fewer. You can do an inline twist and a half loop, but that's it. There is no corkscrew or a vertical loop, despite the fact that these sprites for these pieces do exist in the game, as the twister and inverted coaster types do have both of them. And so does the lay-down coaster. It may not have banked sloped turns, but the vertical loop gives it some nice variety, and the corkscrew, in addition to variety, also increases its flexibility greatly. Just look at this really cool element, you cannot do that with the flying coaster or any other coaster type. I think this is the only time in the game where I prefer the Vekoma version of a roller coaster, just for its greater variety. What the laydown coaster does miss that you would expect it to have is a quarter helix. Inverted coaster types often have these available, and the compact inverted coaster indeed does have it, so there seems to be no reason for the laydown to not have it when it's in its inverted mode, but it just doesn't. The flying coaster does get it, and I have no idea why, if that one gets it, the laydown doesn't. But it gets weirder, as RCT Classic kind of does give the laydown a quarter helix, or maybe not? When I was doing some testing, I actually was able to build the quarter helix in Classic, but it was invisible. It worked properly, it didn't crash or anything, it was just that the track piece was invisible. But when I then tried it again the next morning, I couldn't build it for some reason, and no matter what I tried, the game never showed me the quarter helix again. I thought I had maybe dreamt it or something, But when I asked if someone could see if they could build it, Extreme97 was able to and provided me with this screenshot, but then when they tried to do the same in the track designer, it wasn't there anymore. I have no idea what's going on and what triggers it to be available, but if you do manage to build it, like in this track design that I imported from OpenRCT2, it will work but be invisible. And that's not the only track piece that will be invisible in Classic, as on the flying coaster the upright level to banked slope and banked slope to level pieces will also be invisible. This time there's not even a good reason for it. It's a perfectly normal track piece that works fine in the original game, but somehow Classic screwed it up and made it invisible. Just like the quarter helix, it will function normally, so you don't have to worry about it. It's just a visual glitch. What allowed me to build this laydown coaster with quarter helixes is OpenRCT2, which has added several track pieces to both rides. The laydown got these inverted banked quarter helixes and upright large level to steep and steep to level track pieces, which are useful when you're doing big hills. Both of them also got the sloped large turns, and naturally the flying coaster got the banked variant of it too. The flying coaster also got a few new inversions with the large half loops and the quarter loop, although still no corkscrews. However, recently they also got another few new track pieces. The quarter helix, as we discussed earlier, does exist in the original game, but it's quite limited. The flying coaster, inverted coaster and compact inverted coaster have the banked variant, while the swinging suspended coaster has the unbanked variant. To me, these don't even feel that unique, since this is just how inverted helixes are in the game, but they do behave a bit differently. A standard helix goes up or down by 2 units every full circle, but that wouldn't be enough clearance for inverted coaster types, so with these quarter helixes they instead have a difference of 4 units every time they go around. The OpenRCT2 team thought it would be quite neat if we could have these on more coaster types, and so this was implemented, with most of the work done by Mix. As a result, tons of upright coaster types now have banked and unbanked quarter helixes available, including the laydown and the flying coasters. These give the coaster some really neat extra flexibility when in their upright mode, and the only variant that's still missing is the upside down unbanked quarter helix, as that doesn't exist yet outside of the swing suspended coaster. I haven't used these a ton yet, but this laydown coaster does have 4 upside down quarter helixes in blue, nicely showing off how you can use them if you want to make a turn but also go down 1 unit. Before we take a look at the stats, I want to briefly go back to Roller Coaster Tycoon 1, as that is quite interesting too. Quite a few coaster types from RCT1 got split into multiple coaster types in the sequel. An example of this is the inverted coaster, which in RCT1 actually has a launched mode, but in RCT2 that got taken away and transformed into the inverted impulse coaster instead. The laydown and the flying coaster types have something similar. For the most part, it's kind of just the case that only the Vekoma model existed, and it was called, confusingly enough, the flying roller coaster. It is almost exactly the same as the Vekoma laydown coaster in RCT2, except that you can build inverted stations on it, allowing you to have both an upright station and an inverted station on the same ride. This gives you a bit of extra flexibility and allows you to build weird designs like this. Okay, so the stats of the laydown and flying coasters. Their excitement and intensity are not all that interesting, as they're very standard, but their nausea is very high. The laydown coaster is still not too bad, as it's kind of what you can expect from an inverted coaster type, with this ride for example having 7.7 excitement, 7.9 intensity and an accompanying 6.0 nausea rating. That's high and will cause a bunch of puke, but that's also just what inverted ride types do. The flying coaster though completely goes through the roof. This design has 8.4 excitement and 8.2 intensity, which is a bit higher than the laydown coaster we just saw, but the nausea is much higher at 7.3. It's impossible to build a flying coaster with a nausea rating that doesn't make most people puke their brains out, and that's a serious downside. We can compare it better with these two rides. This laydown and flying coaster are as identical as I could make them in order to show off the difference in how their EIN stats, excitement, intensity and nausea, behave. You can see that the flying coaster has higher stats all across the board, but most significantly so for nausea. The reason for this is rather simple, as it's all caused by the base stats of the two rides. Every ride type has certain base stats that it always gets, and then it gets more EIN stats from the speed, the length, the g-forces, the drops and so on. The extra stuff that these two get is identical, the difference is all in the base stats. Whereas the laydown starts out with 3.85, 1.15 and 2.75, the flying coaster starts with 4.35 excitement, 1.85 intensity and 4.33 nausea. The differences between these are 0.5, 0.7 and a massive 1.58, and that is where the crazy high nausea rating on the flying coaster comes from. This does mean that you can charge a bit more for the flying coaster and that it's easier to reach a certain target excitement rating with it if the goal requires that or when the harder gas generation is enabled. That comes at the cost of significantly more puke though. I put two handymen down who both have a patrol area of 25 path tiles so that we can observe the difference. The laydown handyman has swiped up a total of 1000 pukies, while the flying one has done about 1150, so the flying coaster has produced about 15% more puke in this controlled test. It's not quite as bad as I expected, but it's still a significant increase. The flying coaster does have an advantage with the trains though, because they are more compact and can be longer. The laydown has a maximum train length of 6 cars, while the flying can go up to 7 and in RCT2 even up to 8. This gives it a little bit of extra excitement while also increasing the throughput of the ride. And as I mentioned, the flying trains are also more compact, which is handy if you only have space for a short station. For example, on this 5-tile station, the laydown coaster can do 2 trains of 4 cars, while the flying coaster does 2 trains of 5 cars, again increasing throughput. The expansions also gave them some new train types, with the Harpies train for the laydown coaster and the Condor and Pterodactyl trains for the flying coaster. These are just reskins and behave the exact same, so it's only for looks. A weird downside of the flying coaster is that for some unknown reason you cannot change the chainlift speed on it. Every other coaster type with a traditional chainlift has the option of a few different speeds, and so does the laydown with 6, 8 or 9 km an hour, but the flying coaster doesn't and is locked in at a very slow 6 km an hour. That seems very much like a bug to me and not an intentional decision, and RCT2 has indeed fixed this and now you have the same options as the laydown coaster. Another downside is that the flying coaster is a bit more expensive to build. If we go back to the design that we used to compare the stats and look at the costs instead, then the laydown coaster costs 8,131 euros to build and the flying coaster is about 17% more expensive with 9,539. That's not a surprise, as the B&M variant is always more expensive than the similar Vekoma model. Higher stats and banked sloped curves do cost something after all. Interestingly, the laydown coaster is a bit more expensive than both the corkscrew and compact inverted coaster types, while the flying coaster sits in between the twister and inverted coaster. The differences between these aren't too big though, and the main takeaway is that the B&M version of a coaster type is always the more expensive one. In terms of attracting guests, these are both pretty damn effective, with attracting 100 guests to your park for every one of these coasters you build. That is really high, with only 5 ride types attracting more, and some significant ones like the looping and vertical drop coaster types attracting a little bit less even. That is probably because the whole flying thing makes these quite unique, so it makes sense that they attract more guests. The similarities continue as the stat requirements are also identical between these two rides. They both need to have at least 2 drops, a top speed of at least 36 km an hour, at least 0.4 negative Gs and at least 1 inversion. That final one tries to enforce you to make use of both the upright and upside down mode, but you can just do 1 quick inversion and be done with it, so it's not really all that effective. Like on a lot of coaster types, if you have at least 1 inversion, the requirements for the drop count and the negative Gs are ignored and you no longer have to fulfill them. But since having an inversion is also a stat requirement on these, that essentially means that the requirements for drop count and negative Gs don't really exist. You're only gonna notice them when you're already getting penalized for missing an inversion, in which case they'll penalize you even more. Speaking of penalties, those are different between these two types. The most common penalty for missing a stat requirement is dividing all the 3 EIN stats by 2, but here it's a little different. The laydown coaster does do that for the top speed, negative Gs and drop count requirements, but if it misses an inversion then the excitement rating gets divided by 4 instead of just 2. The flying coaster does it completely differently, with not penalizing the intensity and nausea rating at all, while dividing the excitement by 2 for every requirement, including the inversion one. That leads to this silly situation where a small flat laydown circle has low stats all across the board, while the equivalent flying coaster still has 2.8 intensity and a massive 4.7 nausea. And now it's time to talk about some efficient ride designs, where we can still learn a bunch of new interesting things. As usual, all of them are available for download in the description if you would like to use these yourself. We start with the cheapest rides and then go more and more expensive. You could go the very standard route and do a chain lift into a drop followed by an inversion. The laydown is slightly smaller because there's access to the corkscrew, but the flying coaster has a shorter ride time because of the unsplit chain lift. It doesn't really matter though which does what, as we can do so much better than these. Behold, the quick twist design. You go down with a turn, do an inline twist with a photo section in the middle and then come back up again. No chain lift needed, so a much shorter ride time, and the longer station even allows for double trains. You can actually do the same on a good number of other ride types, and it's a really nice and efficient design. The high up station does mean you need to pay the very expensive path support, but that's more than worth it. The laydown version is the cheaper one with lower stats, which in terms of the nausea can actually be an advantage as it means less puke. The throughput of up to 3,800 guests per hour is actually completely insane for a coaster that, including the path, still costs less than 3,000 euros. The flying coaster does win in terms of pure profit, as the higher stats mean you can charge a bit more, while the longer trains lead to a higher throughput of up to 4,200 guests an hour. The difference in construction cost is only very marginal though, as the flying coaster is closer to the ground, saving in support costs. When you change from inverted to upright mode, you actually move up a unit and go from 0 to 1.5 meters, and that also means that if you do the opposite, you move down a unit back down to 0 meters. For the flying coaster, that means when you do the inline twist, the middle will be higher up, and that works, but on the laid down coaster the middle will be lower, and suddenly you need an extra unit of clearance at the bottom, which moves the entire design up by 1 unit. It is still the cheaper version, but not by very much, especially since all the paths will also be more expensive. If space is more of a concern, then both types do have a smaller option available that still passes all the stat requirements. The laid down coaster has this cutback design, which is really weird. The train fails to make it up the first cutback, then goes back down, travels the entire track backwards and finishes. How is it possible that it does make the backwards cutback while not making it over the forwards one? That probably has to do with the fact that downward corkscrews give more speed than they should. Upward ones also make you lose more speed than you should, so it balances out over a full corkscrew or full cutback, but since it's pushed up the first one out of the station, you don't lose any speed there while still gaining the extra speed of going down it. Because this design only has one train and a longer ride time, it's nowhere near as profitable as the quick twist one, but it's incredibly space efficient, especially if you build a bunch of them in between two paths and connect the entry and exit lines through the corkscrews. The smaller flying coaster design is actually maybe the most overpowered design in this entire video. Because the flying coaster starts inverted, you can immediately do a downwards half loop, which allows you to make this super simple loop design. Not only is this super short and tiny, but because its trains are quite compact, you can actually fit 2 3-car trains on this 3-tile station and still have space left for a photo section. Just like the quick twist design, this can reach a throughput of up to 4,200 guests per hour, while being a lot cheaper and smaller while only having slightly lower stats. Even with the path, it's only 2,300 euros in a 3x8 space. That's extremely cheap and small for over 4,000 guests an hour. Although what we also should think about is how long the guest spends on the ride. Yeah, the ride itself is very short with just a few seconds, but they also need to walk up the queue line and walk down the exit path, which means that it does take them longer to be able to move on to the next ride. The laydown cutback design is actually shorter, as it has basically no exit path and a much shorter queue line. The fewer rides a guest can go on in a certain time period, the less money they will make you, so it could be possible that a design with the station on the ground, thus a short exit path, is better in some situations. Still though, it's an incredible design that is completely unique to the flying coaster, and I love it. If you want to go a bit less small because you don't like the smell of too much cheese, then my medium designs may be up your alley. The flying coaster version again makes use of the ability to go down with an immediate half loop, making descending after a hill very space efficient. Then it just goes around one extra time to get some extra drops and an extra inversion in to increase the stats. One neat aspect of this ride is that while it does use the steep lift hill exploit, it still only has one chain lift section, as you don't need one on the very first piece. The train is long enough to reach past that right out of the station. That saves on operating costs, which isn't very much, but it is something nonetheless. The 4 tiny designs actually all have no chain lift at all, making them very cheap to operate, which if you're spamming microcoasters can actually make a significant difference. Just like the 2 small flying coaster designs, the medium one can once again hit a throughput of up to about 4,200 guests an hour, which is really strong. This is a fantastic design if you want something that is very efficient without making it feel too cheesy. For the laydown coaster, I've done something completely different and I've gone for 5 corkscrew cutbacks in a row, and similar to the small flying coaster loop, this design is completely unique to the laydown coaster. Not the cutbacks, many rides can do that, but the final extended one with the 3 inverted straight pieces to make room for the queue line is something that only the laydown coaster can do. All these inversions give it quite high stats, and the ticket price actually comes to the exact same maximum as the medium flying coaster at €13.20 for a new one in this park. The maximum throughput is slightly lower, with about 3,700 guests an hour, but that's still really good and I'm incredibly happy with this design. And finally, there are the large designs, which are for when you want raw high stats and many trains. For the flying coaster I came to this design, which has 7.3 excitement, 9.4 intensity and 7.7 nausea. These stats make it perfect for a scenario where guests prefer more intense rides, although it will still work in a normal scenario, just be sure to have a handyman on standby near the exit. Because it's a bit longer, it doesn't always have a train ready in the station, so the throughput is a bit lower, but that length does make it perfect for scenarios with harder guest generation, as it does cross the threshold of 600 meters with an impressive 601 meters of length. You do have to be careful with that though, as it will only get that length if the testing train has to traverse the entire station, so make sure that the other 2 trains have already departed by the time the testing train returns. And last but certainly not least, as it is my favorite design of the video, is the big laydown coaster. Because this ride has, unlike the flying coaster, access to vertical loops, you can make it do interlocking vertical loops, and that gives it a massive excitement bonus. This bonus is so good that this design has significantly higher excitement than the big flying coaster with 7.9, while having less intensity and nausea. And not only that, as because it's the Vekoma model, it's also about €1,800 cheaper to build. The shorter trains do mean the throughput is a bit lower, but it's still very good, and the lower nausea will result in significantly less puke. The thing I'm most proud of is that I managed to make this ride only 6 tiles wide, which is only possible for interlocking loops if you approach the sideways loop with steep turns like I did here. It all fits perfectly, and I think this is one of my better custom designs that I have made. Oh, and just like the flying coaster, this is more than 600 meters long, making it useful for scenarios with harder guest generation. And those are the laydown and flying coaster types. They are very fun to use because they are so unique, and unlike some other unique ride types, these are also still very strong and don't get outclassed by other coaster types. Even though the flying coaster has higher stats and access to banked sloped turns, I think the laydown coaster is a little bit better, as the corkscrews give it unparalleled flexibility, the vertical loops can give it a lot of excitement, and the lower nausea is actually a good thing. Big thanks to everyone who sent in a ride for me to feature in this video, and if you want to learn more about different ride types, then you can click here to see the previous ride overview all about the water coaster. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.